passion, confidence, composure, enthusiasm, ability to be a team player, analytical skills, foresight. These are the characteristics of a scholar, and they most definitely apply to our speaker this morning. Dr. Peniel Joseph holds a joint professorship appointment at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and the History Department in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. He is also the founding director of the LBJ School's Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. He was born and raised in New York and was educated at Stony Brook and Temple Universities. Dr. Joseph is the author of a number of award-winning books, including Stokely, A Life, which has been called the definitive biography of Stokely Carmichael, the man who popularized the phrase Black Power. Last Thursday, I had the opportunity to observe his passion, confidence, composure, and enthusiasm on a Zoom presentation from Shazy. Dr. Joseph was interviewed by Kerry Clark on his most recent book, The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Whatever you think you know about these leaders, put it aside, because you are about to be educated. Please give Dr. Peniel Joseph a warm MBC welcome, Zoom style.
Thank you, Penny, and thank you, Cindy, for the invitation. I know we don't have a bunch of time, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about my book and then seg into the way we're living now. And the title of the talk was Building the Beloved Community, and really get into what I mean by that. My name, like Penny said, is Peniel Joseph. A lot of people don't know where that first name comes because no one reads the Bible anymore. I grew up in New York City, the proud son of Haitian immigrants who were deeply religious. So I had to read the Bible several times before the age of 10. And so Peniel comes from Genesis 31, and it's where Jacob is wrestling with the angel all night, and he calls the place Peniel, and it literally means, for I've seen the face of God yet lived. And my middle name is Amias, which is a city in the Old Testament. My last name is Joseph, and if anybody's ever read the Old Testament as well, Joseph is a very significant figure in the Old Testament. And so I say that as a preface to my talk because I grew up in a household. My mother is 81 years young and safe from COVID in New York City. I grew up in a household that was a labor household, a trade unionist household. My mother worked for SEIU 1199. She worked at Mount Sinai Hospital on East 92nd Street. And so I was on picket lines during the Carter administration. And I remember when Ronald Reagan was elected president, and I was in elementary school, and my mother told me that Reagan was a racist. Reagan was a bad man. She knew Reagan from the 60s and what he had done to the Black Panthers, and that Reagan didn't like Dr. King, and that don't listen to what anybody said, bad times were coming ahead for all of us. My mother was my first feminist, my first historian. She taught us about Haitian history, African-American history. She said that women deserve the right to vote way before 1920. Really remarkable, because this is what I got every single day at the dinner table. So in a lot of ways, I thought I was going to be a day-to-day organizer. I organized for Black history at my high school. I was in marches against police brutality in New York City in the 1980s during the Koch administration. So my history is a very, very specific history. We were a family that understood about multicultural and multi-generational. My mother had a lot of Eastern European and Russian Jewish friends and colleagues, and we talked about resisting anti-Black racism, resisting anti-Semitism as well. I went to high school with a lot of Italian and Irish and Greek, in addition to African-American. So my history is a very, very specific history. So when I come to the space of talking about the beloved community, it's really through shared experience, and it really is through understanding and recognizing the difficulties of building that beloved community. We have a generational opportunity, and I've been writing and organizing, and I've been in this space of anti-racism for 40 years now. I'm 47. And when we think about the beloved community, what we've done, and with the sword and the shield, my new book tries to do, is we've painted Dr. King into a corner as this kind of saint, this kind of person who never made anybody mad, this kind of nonviolent saint, this American Gandhi. We also paint Malcolm X into a corner too, as this fiery rebel, this warrior who never hugged a baby, who wasn't a father, who never had any fear, and sort of was this angry young man. And in The Sword and the Shield, I argue that, you know, nothing could be further from the truth. And instead of looking at them as American dream versus nightmare, we look at them as two sides of a revolutionary coin, with one looking for Black dignity, radical Black dignity, and that's Malcolm X, and the other arguing for radical Black citizenship, that's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And both of them, over the course of their careers, are actually after human rights. And surprisingly, even as Malcolm X starts off as the boldest critic of white supremacy, really of the 20th century, Dr. King takes up that mantle, never talking about violence, but he uses nonviolence as a political sword to talk about ending poverty, ending the war in Vietnam, ending American imperialism and racism and white supremacy. And he names names. I mean, one of the reasons why Dr. King breaks with the Lyndon Johnson administration is not because he disbelieves in the Great Society, but it's because he realizes that most of the money that should be going to the Great Society is going into the war in Vietnam. And instead of saying that he's willing to sanction what he thinks is an illegal, immoral war, and we all realize this now. I think most of us who are of good conscience realize that the Vietnam War was a tragic mistake that not only killed 50,000 Americans needlessly, but killed many, many more in Vietnam and then Cambodia, including little babies who they were dropping napalm on. So Dr. King says April 4th, 1967 at the Riverside Church in New York City that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And when he says that, he's actually echoing what Malcolm X had said in '63 about chickens coming home to roost in the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination. And Malcolm wasn't happy that Kennedy had been assassinated. He was saying that a nation that is deploying violence domestically and internationally in the manner that the United States was should not be surprised when that violence came home. And right now in 2020, we have our own chickens coming home to roost moment with over 4,700 protests around the country, the most ever over the last 2 months. 7 to 26 million self-identified Americans have said they've joined the protests, including many white Americans, not just Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So we're in a really watershed moment. And for all of us who are in this space of wanting to do everything from anti-racism to social justice, we think about the environment, we think about people who are non-able-bodied, we think about LGBTQ. There's a realization that race and racism and resisting racism is central to all these issues. Anything that people are interested in, instead of thinking about that issue as tangential, we've got to think about it as central, because the United States is rooted in a system of racial slavery, our origin story, that created a caste system. And when I teach this, I teach my students that a caste system is just a hierarchy. It's just a ladder. And when you think about that ladder, white people and whiteness is at the top and Black people at the bottom. Doesn't mean there's no discrimination and racism against Latinx and Asian and Native American and Indigenous. What it means is that because of racial slavery, anti-Black racism is the organizing principle of that racial caste system. And until we have that come to Jesus moment, until we have that Paul on the road to Damascus moment, and remember, I'm an old Baptist, Southern Baptist boy by way of a New York City storefront church. So I make biblical allusions all the time because I had to read the Bible over and over and over again. So it became like an adventure story to me. And so I love the Old Testament and the New Testament. So I can battle scripture with the best reference around because of Jermaine Joseph, my mother. So when we think about this moment that we're in, when Dr. King talked about shared sacrifice, he didn't mean that only Black people were going to sacrifice. Dr. King is somebody who actually is very, very critical of white supremacy, and we really forget the 65 to 68 part of King. After the Voting Rights Act is passed and the Los Angeles Rebellion, the first one of 1965, because there's a second one in 1992. After that explodes, King really says that what we need is a massive redistribution of justice and wealth in the United States. So what's so extraordinary about Dr. King is his ability and willingness to speak truth to power, even after becoming Time Magazine's Man of the Year and becoming the youngest recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. So King uses nonviolence as a political sword to talk about radical Black citizenship. And what does he mean by that? Well, King says that citizenship is not just the end of racial oppression, it's the visible appearance of justice that he's going to define as a guaranteed income. So way before Andy Young, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Andy Yang, way before Andy Yang said, let's do a universal basic income, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about a universal basic income for everyone. He understood that anti-Black racism was the organizing principle, but he organizes Native Americans, he organizes Latinx folks who are farm workers, poor whites from Appalachia, and Black folks from Marks, Mississippi. But what's truly extraordinary about King's final years is how he starts to echo the language of Malcolm X, who's been assassinated by the beginning of 1965. And so Malcolm X had been Black America's prosecuting attorney and really charged white America with a series of crimes against Black humanity that dated back to racial slavery and continued in the present. So Malcolm X does not defend Black humanity to white people in the same way that King does as a defense attorney. Malcolm takes Black humanity as a given, and he's more interested in organizing radical Black political self-determination. You may have often heard the phrase, by any means necessary. Over time, Malcolm has an evolution and comes to see his mission as a human rights mission, leaves the Nation of Islam, and is really traveling overseas, including meeting up with Congressman John Lewis in 1964 in Africa when they were both touring Africa. And John Lewis mentions this in his memoir and how impressed he was by Malcolm X. Of course, John Lewis was a disciple of Martin Luther King Jr. He's the youngest speaker at the March on Washington at 23 years old. And certainly his passing is a great loss for America and the world. When we think about King, however, King starts echoing the language of Malcolm X. Malcolm had accused white America of a series of crimes, and by the time King is organizing the Poor People's Campaign, he's in Marks, Mississippi in 1968, which is the poorest zip code in the United States. He's left in tears when he sees so many Black families with children who do not have any shoes to wear on their feet in Marks, Mississippi. And he tells all the people there, and we've got the video of him doing this, that the way they are living is a crime, right? And what King organizes, the Poor People's Campaign in 1968, is an Occupy Washington movement. It's a movement to occupy the nation's capital. King is not bringing any guns, any knives, any curse words, but the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, they are screaming, the British are coming, the British are coming. All this violence is coming because King is bringing a mule train of poor people to Washington, D.C. And that's the United States of America. So all the polling that we have on Dr. King by the late 60s, white folks hate Dr. King. And I'm gonna say it again, white folks hate Dr. King. Okay? And they hate Dr. King, not because of violence, but because of his anti-racism. And he's saying what is happening in the United States, what is happening in Vietnam is illegal and immoral, and there will be a political reckoning. That's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So he is a political revolutionary. He's not somebody who would give us all hugs and blow us kisses in 2020. What he was a prophetic figure who challenged all of us to achieve a different country. King argued that America had to engage in what he said was going to be a bitter but beautiful struggle to achieve what the founders had argued for. But King expanded the vision of the founders. In the letter from Birmingham jail in 1963, he says the young people were being arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, were being brutalized by German shepherds and fire hoses that are powerful enough to strip the bark off of trees in Kelly Ingram Park in Birmingham. He said that one day they're going to be recognized as heroes for bringing us back to those great wells of democracy that were dug deep by the founding fathers. And it's King who inspires John F. Kennedy in 1963, June 11th, to have really an incredible speech where he talks about racial justice. But President Kennedy says that there's a revolution happening in 1963, June 11th, 1963. You can Google the speech and you can hear John F. Kennedy. And Kennedy says, those who do nothing invite shame and violence, and those who act boldly recognize right as well as reality. This is 1963. So when we think about Martin Luther King Jr., when we think about Malcolm X, this idea of the sword and the shield, what they faced in the context of the 1960s, we are facing as well. Everybody always wonders what they would do if they had been back in the day in these historical moments. You're living it now. People wonder what would they have had for breakfast during these incredible historical times. You had your breakfast already. You're living it right now. So anybody who's wondering, what are they going to tell their children and their grandchildren? What did they do to bring more justice to the world? The responsibility, and it's not a burden, the responsibility is on your shoulders right now, to work in that space, and not to pretend, not to have performative politics, because we've all seen the performance of whether it's Amazon or other corporations that are saying Black Lives Matter under pressure, but their whole organizational philosophy contradicts that support, right? So the onus is on you to act ethically. The onus is on you to have personal sincerity and political integrity in this space. But this idea of building a beloved community, King argued that a beloved community was going to be free of racial injustice. It was going to be free of racial segregation. We live in one of the most segregated cities in the United States and the world, one that is the recipient of pervasive, not just racial discrimination, but residential segregation, public school segregation, deep-seated inequities that go back to the 1928 plan and before that mandated racial segregation, and a complete inability to understand what the moral and political and economic reverberations have been from our past and consistent actions. And that includes the University of Texas, where I work. That includes the city of Austin. That includes nonprofit, for-profit, Austin, Silicon Valley. It includes every single aspect of how we live as Americans, right? And so this moment, it does offer an opportunity, but it only offers an opportunity if we're willing to be sincere, right? It only offers an opportunity if we're willing to be in this space every single day for the rest of our lives, and that we bequeath that same resilience, that same really political and deep religious and personal faith that people like John Lewis, that people like Fannie Lou Hamer, that these civil rights heroes exhibited. Very briefly, and then I'll close, when we think about this BLM 2.0, and really this is the second iteration of the Black Lives Matter movement. The first was in 2013 after the political, the murders of people like Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner. We've had in Texas, Sandra Bland, Corinne Gaines, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and of course, George Floyd. And these deaths have continued after George Floyd. This is an extraordinary moment because the Black Lives Matter movement argued that the criminal justice system in the United States represented a gateway to panoramic systems of racial and economic and gender oppression and sexuality oppression. And what's extraordinary is the number of people who've come to the streets, marched and demonstrated, placed democracy in the streets, and said that they want to achieve a different country. But we have a lot of work to do because there are thousands of racist policies right here in Austin included when it comes to residential codes, when it comes to what we do with our tax policies, when it comes to what we do with housing, when it comes to what we do with education policy as well. So we have to not only eliminate thousands of racist policies, we actually have to put in and institutionalize anti-racist and racial equity policies. And so we have an extraordinary amount of work to do, but one of the reasons I'm optimistic about this time is the fact that some of us have been in this space and there's expertise that people can actually use and rely on in terms of next steps, right? This goes beyond the symbolism that's still needed of tearing down Confederate monuments. It goes beyond the symbolism, which I support and is needed, of Juneteenth and what does Juneteenth mean, especially for those of us in Texas and Galveston, and we celebrated it this past year. We should continue to do that in a more formal way. It really says, when we think about anti-racism and achieving racial justice in this beloved community, Black people, even in Austin, where we're only 8%, because of a politics of racist gentrification here that has been supported in a bipartisan way, just like the mass incarceration system has been supported in a bipartisan way. Because of racist gentrification, the 8% here are not even represented in positive social economic indicators the way they should. So when we think about racism and how it appears, it's overrepresentation in negative social economic indicators and underrepresentation in all positive, right? And anti-racism is understanding that this is systems and not people's behaviors, right? Because if you're an anti-racist, or you're trying to be, you're in a space of understanding that there are no biological differences between us, and nobody's culture, Black, white, Native American, is pathologically negative or bad, right? Nobody's culture is superior, where you say, wow, those Germans make such great clocks or something. And nobody's culture is inferior. That's the anti-racist space. So if you understand that, you don't blame people who are overrepresented in negative social economic indicators. You don't say it's their behavior, it's their parents, they're wearing baggy pants. You don't say that. Right? You understand that systems have done this, and the problematic with those systems is that we've allowed them to amplify and flourish since the heroic period of the civil rights movement. So things have not gotten better for most people, irrespective of Barack and Michelle Obama or Jay-Z and Beyonce. It doesn't work like that. The outlying success of extraordinary Black figures does not trickle down to 44 million other Americans. It just does not work like that. Even if people feel good because we elected a Black president twice, it doesn't work like that. So the positives for us is that all of us who are interested in this social justice space, we can actually get together and organize, and people are doing this already. And some of this is connected to calls in a policy sense, when people talk about prison abolition, transforming the police, defunding the police, and they're talking about resources and reimagining public safety, not saying that there's going to be no more police in the United States. They're saying they want justice for all people and not just justice for white people. When people talk about reimagining public safety, imagine the white suburbs, imagine Hyde Park everywhere and Tarrytown everywhere. I live in a predominantly white neighborhood right here in Hyde Park. The reason why people can't imagine it is because we don't have empathy for Black people. We don't have empathy for Black babies. We don't have empathy for pregnant Black mothers. We don't have empathy for Black men and women who've got mental illness and bipolar and depression. We shoot them, we marginalize, we incarcerate them, but we're also super exploiting them because we actually make money from their incarceration and their marginalization. We make money when we kill Black people, when we lead Black people to premature death, when we place them in our local jails. We make money when we cast the specter of Blackness as why we need even bigger police budgets and why we need even further segregation, why we need to protect and co-sit and place Black place white people in sinecures and bubble wrap so that this Black presence will not ever get access to the University of Texas unless they're football players or basketball players. This Black presence will never get access to Austin, Silicon Valley, unless you're Robert Smith and you're a private equity billionaire who's got money and they want access to you. This Black presence will never get access to any of the fruits of American democracy, even as it's labored historically to create the wealth that created American democracy. So we have a specific opportunity to educate ourselves, to acknowledge past wrongs, right? To understand that we are at a moral and political reckoning right now that's just gonna continue, right? That's just gonna continue unless and until we say we wanna achieve our country in a different way by acknowledging the depth and breadth of systemic racism, structural violence, what white supremacy means, but then saying that we can actually transform the situation. That's the positive. The positive is saying that we can actually transform this by erecting thousands of anti-racist policies that are going to produce not just more equitable outcomes, but equity. We want equity, right? There's a way where we can fix this. If this was happening to white people, we would have fixed it. And we know it because we live in the country. We know it, okay? We know how we treated crack cocaine versus the opioid crisis, right? Crack cocaine got incarcerated and we called the mothers crack whores and we said that they were crack monsters. I lived through that in New York City. Opioids, we said these people need medical attention. They need help. It needs to be, they shouldn't go to jail. We had sheriffs in the Midwest saying, I'm not putting any of these good white people in jail. I'm gonna get them help. I don't think that how we treated the white people was bad. I think how we treated the Black people was immoral and criminal, and we should all be ashamed. It's a public embarrassment, right? It's a public humiliation for the entire nation state in front of the entire world, right? And so what we have to do is say, we want to treat all people here equitably, but we understand we have a racist problem. It's not a race problem. We always say we have a race problem. It's not a race card. The problem is of white supremacy and systemic anti-Black racism, which produces these disparities. That's the problem. And the more we say it, the more able we will be to confront the problem. It's like alcoholism or some kind of addiction. Unless you admit, hey, I've got a problem, you're gonna keep drinking, you're gonna keep taking the pills until something really bad happens. We have never said as a nation, we have a problem. We have a problem. And that problem is an addiction to anti-Black racism, it's an addiction to white supremacy, and it's an addiction to the denial of the problem. And 2020 has been extraordinary because the combination of the COVID pandemic, the combination of mass unemployment, the combination of George Floyd's murder and in the uprisings after have been the first time nationally that the United States of America has said millions of people, including millions of white people, tens of millions, we have a problem and we want to fix it. We want to solve it, right? So those of us in Austin who are working in this space, we have huge opportunities. I think Cindy, I don't know if they sent you, I can talk briefly about the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy and what we're doing at the LBJ School, but we have organizations and experts. We have fellows who are connected with Notley and other organizations who are working on anti-racism, working on voting rights, working on policy solutions, but we also do public gatherings and convenings, including we continue to do these webinars in the context of COVID in terms of bringing people together who want to talk about this and want to have social impact. And we also do curriculum and pedagogy. So we've been doing anti-racist seminars. We're working with teachers, K through 12, both in Austin, AISD, the Eanes, other school districts about anti-racism teacher training, but transforming the curriculum as well so our students can get a more holistic understanding of this history. Because remember, talking about anti-racism is not hating America. It's a sign of deep patriotism and love for America. Dr. King loved the United States of America. He loved America and American democracy more than America loved Black people. because he believed in American democracy, small d democracy that's away from partisanship, that means a republic and a system of government where people decide and represent themselves. And that's what King believed in, deep democracy. So this is something that I think is a hugely unbelievable generational opportunity for all of us, but we have to embrace it. And it is going to be hard. It's not easy. Everybody wants things that are fast, quick, and easy in this new age. As somebody who's a Generation Xer, I remember a time before iPhones, and when we had to knock on people's door and connect with people, whether you were organizing or just in relationships. And this is not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy. But the work is going to be immensely valuable. And like John Lewis's life shows us, it's not just about the triumph, it's about the struggle. And that struggle is about building the beloved community. And when white people engage in this struggle, they're able to tap into something that in the context of white supremacy, they never, ever are able to tap into, which is their own humanity, away from thinking that somehow all these positive things that are surrounding them have been earned, because they haven't been. They haven't been. This history is a harsh history that impacts all of us. Black, indigenous, people of color, including immigrants and other people who say, I didn't have anything to do with racial slavery. You had everything to do with it, because it creates a caste system that's letting you access things in an unearned way in this unequal society, right? And so all of us are implicated in this system. All right.
That's very thought-provoking, and there's a lot of questions in the chat. If you don't mind, I'll read it, like we'll go through them. I have to ask this question because there was one. Any comments on the federal troops being sent to Portland right now? Oh, I think you're muted. Sorry.
I just put some stuff in the chat. I'll have Emily send you the live links. I don't know if those links made it. No, I think that our democracy is imperiled. I think one of the reasons why so many millions of people have gotten out on the street demanding justice, and it's both justice in terms of Black citizenship and dignity, but justice for a wide range of Americans who are LGBTQ, who are poor, who are unemployed, who are homeless, who are marginalized, is because we've seen the erosion of our democracy. And that erosion is absolutely connected to systemic racism and white supremacy, because what racism allows us to do is divide groups of people who might more ordinarily see that they have deep commonalities together, right? So the division between poor whites and poor Blacks and Latinx and undocumented, these divisions have been amplified and exacerbated over the last decades. It's really not just this current presidential administration. These divisions are deeply rooted in both our history, the period of racial slavery, Reconstruction and after, the second Reconstruction, which is the Civil Rights Movement, and now I think we're in the midst of a third Reconstruction. So I think these divisions, when we see Portland and troops that don't have any tags, this is about what happens when you are a democracy that's being more and more anti-democratic. And one of the ways you can create that anti-democracy is by saying that there's a pool of Americans who are undeserving. And remember, we have a long history of this. In the 19th century and the early 20th century, there were times, in addition to anti-Black racism, we were saying the Jews weren't deserving. We were saying that the Italians weren't deserving. We were saying that the Irish, you think about 1863 and the riots, the draft riots in New York City, they murdered a ton of Black people, the most, and the second most was Irish immigrants who had been in the United States and who were being treated in an extraordinarily racist way. We call it nativism, but it was just white supremacy and anti-Irish racism, right? So white ethnics in the late 19th, early 20th century absolutely experienced racism. They didn't experience the same kind of anti-Black racism, and they were able to assimilate, but they experienced racism. Jews experienced and continue to experience anti-Semitism and experience extraordinary anti-Semitism, late 19th and early 20th century. And it's really only after World War II that Jewish Americans who are not considered super ethnic and orthodox can at times assimilate, at times anglicize their names. Doesn't mean that anti-Semitism doesn't exist, but one of the interesting ironies when we think about race and place and space in American history is this idea of access to whiteness. Whiteness is a social construction, and who has access to it and who doesn't. So at times, white Jews can be mistaken for white. At times, European Jews can access aspects of whiteness. Doesn't mean that there's no anti-Semitism, but that access is not available to Black Americans. It's just not, you know. You can fool yourself like Tiger Woods and be a billionaire and say you're Cablinasian, and all the white folks around Tiger let him be an honorary white person. But other Black people, you can't do that. You can't just tell the cops that, you know what? You're mistaken, I'm white. You know, you're mistaken, you know, so treat me like you would a white motorist. And the cop says, oh, okay, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that you were white. You know, it doesn't work like that. So Portland is an example of the slippery slope of anti-democracy. But the reason why that can happen is that people have divided the country using race in a very, very divisive way, right? So you create this security force, this criminal justice system, and you're telling white voters that it's to protect you from them, and the them is Black people. That's what you're telling them, right? So law and order becomes this euphemism for I'm going to protect you against Black people, just like Willie Horton was a euphemism for that in 1988. You say Willie Horton, Dukakis let Willie Horton go. He does all these terrible things, and you want a president that's going to protect you from this Black horde.
Dr. Joseph, we actually have to end it at 8:30, but will you stay for a few minutes to answer some more questions? Because I'm sure everybody's...
for 5 minutes, yes.
Okay, cool. So let me thank you so much. This has been an amazing discussion, and we would like to thank you. I typically would hand you the MBC mug and say thank you, but we also have a gift of a year membership to the Metropolitan Breakfast Club. We would like you to come back a lot and join us for many speakers over the next year. Please, big round of applause as a thank you for Dr. Joseph. And I know some of you are leaving for Zoom rooms, we'll hang out for a few more minutes and answer questions. Have a great day. All right, I have there's a lot of related questions here. I think that this one is interesting. On income equality, does a higher minimum wage help, or is that too small of a step?
Yeah, no, I think it's too small of a step. I think I'll show you I always have on my Instagram, my IG, what the points that Black Lives Matter in terms of the policy agenda, what they want, the 10 points, very interesting and reminiscent of the 10 points of the Black Panther Party. And this is just 10, and I completely agree with this. One is reparations, and that's reparations for racial slavery. Sandy Darity, the economist at Duke University, has a brilliant new book, From Here to Equality, that I'm actually teaching for my African American intellectual history seminar in the fall. So, you know, reparations, and we can talk about that. Two, they talk about no bail, no more money bail system. The money bail system in the United States is connected to convict leasing. Three, release all sex workers from jail. That speaks for itself. I agree with that. Four, no death penalty. Five, free education, including higher education. As somebody who benefited from State University of New York at Stony Brook and then got a Ph.D. from Temple, I had to pay a ton of student loans, but I'm all for no education, no free education. Free healthcare, that goes without saying. I mean, we need healthcare for all Americans. All citizens should have healthcare. People with mental illness should not go to state-run asylums where they're mistreated. They should be treated like all of us who go to therapists and want to go in and out and be treated with dignity. So like that. Seven, defund the police. Public safety needs to be rethought and reimagined in the United States. It is intrinsically racist. All you have to do is understand the history of that. You can read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. You can read Khalil Muhammad's The Condemnation of Blackness. You can read Sarah Haley's No Mercy Here. You could read Douglas Blackman's Slavery by Another Name. There's a ton of good work that you can read about this. 8, cut the military budget, and we're thinking about that speaks for itself as well. 9, redistribution of wealth in terms of progressive taxation. 10, publicly financed campaigns, so billionaires don't have more voices than other Americans. So those are just the tip of the iceberg when you think about, it's really, this is beyond everybody who thinks they're going to get away with, hey, a living wage, $15, and then we're good. This is so far beyond that, which is why so many people are, out in the streets. This is not, of course, we need a living wage, but we are way, way past $15 an hour and we're straight, we're set. We can go back to business as usual. This is a fundamental reimagining of our priorities, and it means a fundamental reimagining of democracy in ways that are going to reverberate, and it's going to transform how our public schools look. It's going to transform how higher education looks. It's going to transform not nonprofit spaces, for-profit spaces. It's going to transform how our politics looks and how our culture looks. So I think post-COVID, we're in, and these movements are not going to die out. We're in for a fundamental reordering of American democracy in a very good and positive way, because we need to build and reach a new consensus about what dignity and freedom and citizenship mean in this country, and a new consensus for the first time in American history where no one is left out of that, where people who are gay and who are queer and people who are poor and people who are non-able-bodied, people are not left out of that new consensus of what citizenship means. And when people imagine, well, how did this look? Think of your own lives. Everybody on the Zoom call, we all have relative privilege, because there's a ton of people who can't be on the Zoom call. They don't have the technology, they don't have the access. Our lives have continued. My family's safe. My daughter's upstairs. Everybody's chilling, okay? So think of, when people say, how's this new world gonna look? I tell people who are in my sphere, it's gonna look like your life, where you've got the organic vegetables, you're doing yoga. I do yoga too. We're swimming, we're doing all this stuff, okay? That's how it's gonna look. It's gonna look like the radical wellness that you have in your life, where you're able to vacation and you care about your children and you care about your grandchildren, and they go to some of the best schools, and you're able to read the New York Times book review and the New York Review of Books. It's gonna look like that for other people. That's how it's gonna look. So imagine your life when you're biking, when you're on your first or second or third marriage. Imagine your life and other people having access to that life. Imagine how it is when you're talking to your therapist and you're talking about how you want to change your life and you're talking about past traumas. Imagine people having a conduit, a supply chain of power and privilege, and not a supply chain of misery and grief. That's how it's going to look. All right? So all you have to do is imagine that. And when you think about building that beloved community, imagine expanding your moral circle besides just you and your children and your best friends. So Dr. King implored us to have a moral circle that was as big as the planet. So imagine a moral circle that's not just about you and the people you like and your causes, but a moral circle that is as big as the planet. That's how it looks like. So if you can imagine that, and have that deep empathy, you're not going to say, well, the solution is a $15 minimum wage. It's going to be much bigger than that, because you're going to be able to see yourself in other people and in other communities, even communities that, guess what, don't look like you, and they don't have the same wants and needs as you, but you're going to be able to imagine yourself there. And then you're going to say, oh, I get it. I get it. And how can we organize to make that happen? Because you know already it happened for you, so it can happen for other people. Because we're living it. When everybody says, well, how's this dream look? I'm living it. I'm living it, right? How does this, the nice neighborhood, cops not bothering you? Living it right now. Can it be duplicated and replicated for other people? Yes. And are there resources to do that? Yes. I don't live in a space where I think there's lack and there's no money, and unless it's me and my daughter at this specific school, and we have our nice organic vegetables and avocados and salad, and we're grilling salmon together, right? There's only enough salmon for me and Aya in the entire world. I don't live in that space, right? So we can actually, the way we're living right now, we can actually expand and amplify for other people. I've got to go. I've got to run.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Bye. Oh, that was phenomenal. Thank you guys so much for joining us this morning. I didn't get to most of the questions that were there, but it was such a great talk. I hope everybody had some glimmer of insight into that. Y'all go out and have good Zoom rooms. See you later.
Meeting meets at 9?
Yes, at 9.
Okay.
Are we staying on this channel right here?
Nope, it's the one I sent you, the link.
Okay, let me go find it.
See you there.
All right, see you at 9. Bye, guys.
Bye.